Our journey begins in the northwest of the state on a ranch before heading south towards Spearfish. Then it's on to the Black Hills National Forest and the cowboy town of Deadwood with its surrounding gold mines. At Sturgis, we look at the National Military Cemetery as well as Fort Meade, which has a history stretching back to the early 19th century. To the south is Rapid City, the second largest conurbation in South Dakota, and a centre for tourism because nearby is one of the most popular attractions in the whole of the United States, Mount Rushmore, with its 4 presidents' faces carved into the mountaintop. South Dakota takes its name from the Lakota and Dakota Sioux American Indian tribes and became the 40th state in the Union in 1889. Much of the northwest of the state is open grassland. Cattle ranchers have carved out a living since the 19th century. Some of them now have herds of animals that once roamed freely across the state. Buffalo. They are also known as American bison, and they are the largest living land animal in the United States. 200 years ago, vast herds of buffalo freely migrated across the open grassland of the Great Plains. But gradually they were hunted to near extinction, both by the Indian tribes as well as the new settlers. By the mid-1880s, there were only a few hundred left. Today, the image of 2 young riders herding these majestic beasts brings back the days of the Wild West and the age of cowboys and cowgirls. And they are only able to do this due to a rancher in South Dakota, James Phillip, who bought 5 buffalo in 1899 to preserve the species from extinction. And by the time he died in 1911, the herd had grown to over 1,000. He had, almost single-handedly, saved the buffalo for the nation. In this flat landscape are isolated hills with steep sides, which are known as buttes. The name comes from the days of French settlers and means small hill. They have been formed by erosion, where the surrounding softer rock has gradually worn away, leaving the small section of hard stone. This one is called Haystack Butte, and all across the state these outcrops can be seen. Close by is another called Castle Rock. Spearfish is the largest local town with a population of just over 10,000 people. It came into existence as a result of the Black Hills Gold Rush of 1876. The town grew as a supplier of provisions to the mining camps in the nearby hills. In 1906, Matthews Opera House opened as a centre for entertainment in Spearfish. It's been used for everything from motion picture shows to basketball practice and even a shooting gallery. After extensive restoration in the 1980s, it is still in use as a theatre as well as an arts centre. To the south of the town is Spearfish Canyon, at the northern end of the Black Hills National Forest. Many tourists drive through the Spearfish Canyon Scenic Byway, drawn by the dramatic beauty of the steep-sided valley. The great American architect Frank Lloyd Wright visited the canyon in 1935 and called it unique and unparalleled elsewhere in the country, and wondered, how is it that I've heard so little of this miracle, and we, toward the Atlantic, have heard so much of the Grand Canyon, when this is even more miraculous? Off the main canyon are smaller valleys and a series of waterfalls. These are the Rough Lock Falls, and one of the most photogenic in the Black Hills. It also featured in the final scenes of the film Dances with Wolves. Alongside the Spearfish Canyon Scenic Byway on Highway 14 are the Spearfish Falls, which drop into Little Spearfish Creek. To get a good view, there are numerous trails for those on foot as well as cyclists, which take the visitor through some of the most dramatic parts of the canyon. And the canyon is part of the Black Hills National Forest, which covers an area of over 1 million acres. It was founded back in 1897 after a series of devastating fires, which probably started as a result of a prospector's campfire. And nowhere is more associated with this activity than Deadwood, a name that has become synonymous with the Wild West. The town came into being in the 1870s as a result of the Black Hills Gold Rush, but its creation was also said to have been illegal, as the land had been promised to the Lakota tribe of Native Americans by a treaty in 1868. Its ownership has been in dispute ever since, and these disputes have even reached the United States Supreme Court. The town had a rough and rowdy character and became a centre for gambling and prostitution. But all that nearly came to the end when a devastating fire destroyed over 300 buildings in 1879. Many of the inhabitants left, and the town went into a gradual decline, which continued in the 20th century. In order to revive Deadwood's fortune, gambling was legalized in 1989, and it immediately revived the town's fortunes. One event for which the town is most famous is the killing of Wild Bill Hickok in 1876, who was shot while playing poker. He is buried in the Mount Moriah Cemetery, and in 1903, Calamity Jane, a well-known frontierswoman, was buried next to him at her request. In the same year that Wild Bill Hickok was killed, a cry went up, "There was gold in them thar hills," when it was found a few miles away around what is now the town of Lead. Fabulous fortunes were made in the first few years until one man bought up most of the promising claims and created the Homestake Mining Company. The open cut was once a solid mountain. Over the years, around 48 million tons of ore have been removed to create this half-mile wide and 1,000-foot deep hole. The word homestake came about when a prospector had claimed sufficient gold to make a man rich enough to make his home stake, meaning to make enough money to return home and live comfortably. Over the years, mining expanded and new shafts were dug around the town, and Homestake Mine was to become the biggest, deepest and most productive gold mine in the Western Hemisphere, until it closed in 2002. Since 1876, gold mining at Lead had produced more than 40 million ounces of gold, or just over 1,000 tons. It also produced 9 million ounces of silver as well. In earlier days, mining gold was a labour-intensive business, as a ton of ore had to be blasted or hacked out of the ground and then sifted to produce just 1 ounce of gold. Mining today still carries on in another big pit, but helped by modern machinery. This mechanized style of mining is a far cry from the early days of prospecting, when men just wielded a pickaxe and shovel and dreamed of becoming rich. East of Lead is the town of Sturgis, which is famous for one of the largest annual motorcycle events in the world. It was first held in 1938, and for 1 week in August, over 500,000 motorcycles meet here. To the south of Sturgis is a reminder of the Indian Wars at the Black Hills National Cemetery. This 100-acre site has nearly 20,000 graves. Most of the original interments were soldiers who fell in battle fighting against the Lakota Indians during the 19th century. The Black Hills had been granted to the Indians in the Treaty of Fort Laramie, also known as the Sioux Treaty of 1868. However, Once gold was found in the hills, it was impossible to stop the settlers moving in, and the army was helpless to stop it. Indeed, it was the famous US General George Armstrong Custer who also announced the discovery, which started the Indian Wars. The cemetery is a stark reminder of a broken treaty and the powerful lure of gold. Close by is the Fort Meade National Cemetery, which was established by the surviving members of General Custer's 7th Cavalry after their defeat at the Battle of Little Big Horn, where Custer was killed. Fort Meade itself was built in response to appeals from settlers in the Black Hills for protection against Indian attacks. The fort is perhaps most famous as the place where the Star-Spangled Banner first became the official music for the military retreat ceremony in 1892, long before it was adopted as the United States national anthem. Fort Meade is close to Bear Butte, which lies a few miles to the north. It has been a religious site for the Plains Indian tribes long before European settlers arrived in South Dakota. This is where God imparted to Sweet Medicine, a Cheyenne prophet, the knowledge from which the Cheyenne Indians derived their religious, political, social, and economic customs. The mountain is sacred, and many Native Americans make pilgrimages to the top to leave prayer cloths and bundles tied to the branches of the trees. During the year, various religious ceremonies take place on the mountain, which is a place of prayer, meditation, and peace. Rapid City is the second largest conurbation in South Dakota, with a population of 70,000 people. It began life back in the days of the gold rush, when some unsuccessful miners decided that given the massive influx of prospectors to the area, they would probably do better if they were to put their efforts into building and running a new city. By 1900, it had established itself as a growing tourist destination for visitors to the Black Hills. In the 1940s, the population nearly doubled when the Ellsworth Air Force Base was opened to the east of the city. Today it is home to the 28th Bomb Wing and the B-1B Lancer aircraft, which is a variable sweep-wing strategic bomber. Next to the Air Force Base is Rapid City Regional Airport. Most towns in the state have an airfield, as flying is the best way to get about in such a large area. And in fact, over 50% of aircraft movements at Rapid City are private flights. Scheduled commercial flights only account for around 5%. To capitalize on the growing number of tourists who were coming to see Mount Rushmore in the 1930s, it was decided to construct the Dinosaur Park on a hill overlooking the city. The creatures were also floodlit at night. Today it all seems a little tame, with these ancient creatures now created on films using CGI and animatronics. But back at the time, it was immensely popular, and the park has now been listed on the National Register of Historic Places. On the western edge of Rapid City, in the foothills of the Black Hills, is a reproduction of a Norwegian wooden stave church. It was built in this style during the 1960s to honor the Norwegian settlers who had come to South Dakota during the 19th century. This Lutheran church is an exact replica of one built in Norway over 800 years earlier, the Borgund Stavkirke. The Norwegian Department of Antiquities agreed to supply blueprints, and a Norwegian woodcarver crossed the Atlantic to create some of the fine detail. A generous local couple provided the land and covered all the costs of construction. All they asked for in return was to dedicate the chapel to the memory of his parents, as his father was a pioneering Lutheran pastor. The church is an unexpected and wonderful sight to find in the middle of South Dakota. Further west is Rapid Creek, which gave its name to the city. For much of its length, the creek runs through a steep-sided canyon. It's hard to believe, looking at this beautiful landscape, that it was a scene of devastation 40 years ago. In 1972, the creek truly did become rapid, as floodwater cascaded down the canyon following torrential rain in the Black Hills. Nearly 250 people lost their lives, and over 3,000 were injured. Homes were destroyed, and cars swept away. As a result of the flood, the dam across Rapid Creek was enlarged, making Pactola Reservoir the biggest in the Black Hills. When the dam had first been built, in the 1950s, the new reservoir swallowed up not only the old mining camp of Pactola, but also a military camp of the 1870s. The reservoir supplies water for Rapid City and is also a base for all sorts of outdoor activities, including water sports. The main route south out of Rapid City and into the Black Hills is Highway 16, which winds its way through some spectacular scenery. And along its route are various tourist attractions, including Bear Country. Opened in 1972 with 11 black bears, it now boasts over 200, as well as other animals. It is the largest collection of privately owned black bears in the world. Further along Highway 16 is the turn to Hill City. And once again it was gold that brought about its existence in the 1870s. And when that had been exhausted, tin mining and forestry took over. Surrounded by the Black Hills National Forest, the city has become known as the Heart of the Hills. And when nearby Mount Rushmore began attracting visitors in large numbers, Hill City's economy changed to tourism, with Main Street devoted to hotels, restaurants, and souvenir shops. One of the most popular attractions is the 19th century Black Hills Central Railroad, which was restored and reopened in 1957. The railway line was originally built between Hill City and Keystone in the 1890s as a mining route for gold in the Black Hills. The steam engine is a 2662T articulated mallet built in 1928 by the Baldwin Locomotive Works of Pennsylvania. The carriages date from the early 1900s. The journey ends at Keystone, which is a resort town for the millions of visitors who come to the Black Hills each year. Once a small mining community, like Hill City, it is now also full of hotels, restaurants, and souvenir shops. Leading out of Keystone is Highway 16, where two great carved monuments can be seen. The first is of one of the most iconic Native American leaders, Crazy Horse. It was in 1939 that a Lakota Indian elder wrote to the sculptor Kozak Ziolkowski, saying, "My fellow chiefs and I would like the white man to know that the red man has great heroes too." The idea of the Crazy Horse monument was born, and the Polish-American sculptor, who had worked on Mount Rushmore, which we will see a little later, eventually began in 1948. And it's been going on ever since. The finished monument will reveal Crazy Horse sitting astride his horse, pointing forwards. The sculptor died in 1982, and his family continue to work on it. The powerful face of the great chief was finally revealed in 1998. The task is truly monumental, and it may well take decades before it's finally finished. Not far from the Crazy Horse Monument is Sylvan Lake, which was created in 1881 by damming Sunday Gulch. The lake is known as the crown jewel of Custer State Park and offers swimming, rock climbing, boating and hiking trails. The lake is also used as an entry point for hikers going on to the spectacular Needles. These are a large group of fantastically eroded granite pillars, towers and spires. Indeed, one group is known as cathedral spires. It's a very popular place for climbers, and these two are on top of Little Devil's Tower. And from the top, it's possible to look across to Mount Rushmore. And in fact, the Needles were the first proposed site for the monument, but rejected because they were too thin to support the sculptures. The final site picked for Mount Rushmore is 3 miles to the east. Mount Rushmore features 4 18-meter-high sculptures of former presidents of the United States of America. It was conceived in 1924, construction began in 1927, and ended in 1941. On the left is George Washington, the first president. Next to him is the third president, Thomas Jefferson. Set back in the rock is Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president, and on the far right is Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president. Mount Rushmore is the most popular tourist attraction in South Dakota and regularly gets over 2 million visitors a year. Indeed, it was conceived as a way of boosting tourism back in 1924. One of the most spectacular times to see the monument is at dawn, just as the sun rises above the horizon. For about 10 minutes, the rising sun casts a glorious pink glow over the monument, before the power of the daylight turns it into its natural colour of white granite. It's certainly a sight worth getting up for. Mount Rushmore was chosen by the creator and sculptor Gutzon Borglum because it was the highest mountain in the region, faced southeast, and the granite was fine-grained and sturdy enough to support sculpting. He was quoted as saying that America will march along that skyline. It was originally planned that the figures would be carved from head to waist, but lack of funds forced the carving to end in 1941. Since then, new visitor facilities have been built for the millions of people who often drive from far afield to see one of the truly iconic sights in America. A perfect place to end this journey. Our journey starts at the historic town of Williamsburg, before moving on to the James River and the plantation houses along its banks. Downstream is Jamestown, where early English settlers arrived in the 17th century. From there to the important historical site of Yorktown and the English surrender to George Washington at the end of the War of Independence. To the south is Hampton and the enormous Fort Monroe. Across the estuary is Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world. On the coast is the popular resort of Virginia Beach, overlooking the entrance to Chesapeake Bay. Our journey ends along the unspoilt peninsula of creeks and marshes at Assateague Island and its wild horses. The James River runs right across Virginia, the 10th state to join the Union. It was named after Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen of England, and along the river is much of the early history of America. And an important part of it can be seen at Williamsburg, and in particular, colonial Williamsburg. This is an interpretation of a colonial town where old buildings have been restored and others that were lost recreated. The idea was for visitors to feel the atmosphere and understand the way of life of the 18th century colonists, and in particular to appreciate how the revolutionary leaders lived their lives. Visitors are greeted by interpreters in colonial dress who use the language and diction of the time, and all the shops and the taverns are staffed by people dressed from the past. The modern age is cut out in the 300-acre site. There are no cars, and horse-drawn buggies and wagons drive up and down the streets. This enormous historical project was begun in the 1930s with the generous financial help of John D. Rockefeller. Buildings were rescued and brought to the site, others were restored on their plot of land, and some, like the Governor's Palace, were rebuilt from original plans. A few, like Bruton Church, had been standing for nearly 300 years. And in fact, it was the rector, the Reverend Dr. Goodwin, who started the successful campaign to restore Williamsburg after raising money to restore the church. In the 1920s, he realized that too many of the old buildings were in a terrible state, and that unless something was done about it, they would be lost forever. He was introduced to the Rockefeller family, who made a major financial commitment to the project. It was decided to keep the whole project secret, while old buildings were quietly bought and stored to avoid inflating local property prices. After 2 years of buying up 18th century houses, Goodwin and Rockefeller announced their plans to create Williamsburg. Today, this living museum is one of the state's top attractions, with around 1 million visitors a year. But keeping Williamsburg going is an expensive operation. And in 2007, it was decided to sell the nearby plantation house of Carter's Grove, which John D. Rockefeller had bought in 1969 for the museum. The house was built in 1755 for Carter Burwell, and over the next 200 years it had a succession of owners until the Williamsburg Foundation took over and opened it to the public. However, it was becoming increasingly difficult to attract sufficient visitor numbers, as the house was 7 miles away from the main museum, and so it was decided to set it off with strict controls to ensure the house and landscape would be fully protected. Along the James River are many other plantation houses, and Shirley Plantation is the oldest active one in Virginia and one of the oldest family-owned businesses in America, dating back to 1614. The present house dates from 1723 and was built for the Hill family. It's referred to as the Great House and is largely still in its original state. Tobacco was the main crop, and at the time the European market could not get enough of it. Slaves were used for economic reasons, as cultivating tobacco was very labor-intensive and needed to be produced in large quantities. In the 18th century, tobacco plantations spread across the state to satisfy demand. Slavery was finally abolished in 1865, and those slaves who stayed on became hired workers and known as tenant farmers. Building by the river was prudent, as this was a main highway for exporting and importing goods in Virginia until the arrival of the railway. 250 years ago, great sailing ships would take tobacco from this new world to the old world across the Atlantic. Even today, there's a certain amount of river traffic, as it is still one of the best ways of delivering large, heavy loads. On the east bank is another estate, the Berkeley Plantation. The Harrison family built this three-story brick house in 1726. It was to be the home of two American presidents, William Henry Harrison in 1841 and his son, Benjamin Harrison, in 1889. Berkeley is also well known for three events: the place where the bugle call Taps was composed and played for the first time in 1862, the site where the first bourbon whiskey was distilled in 1621, and perhaps the most famous event was when the Berkeley Plantation held the first official Thanksgiving Day in 1619. This sense of history can be felt all along the river, as a few miles downstream, where the Jamestown to Scotland ferry operates, is the first English settlement in America. It was established by the Virginia Company of London in 1607. 13 years before the Pilgrims on the Mayflower landed in Massachusetts. It was here, on May the 14th, that 104 men and boys began a settlement on the banks of the James River, which they named after King James I. The site may have been a good one for ships on the river, but the land was marshy, no good for crops, and plagued with mosquitoes. And on top of that, the site was in the middle of a chiefdom of about 14,000 Algonquin Indians. After several years of hardship, starvation, disease, and Indian attacks, the colony survived and was to become America's first permanent English colony. The statue is of Captain John Smith, one of the early leaders, who was associated with Pocahontas, the Indian girl who later became a Christian and married one of the settlers. John Smith also championed what he named New England, and said, "Here every man may be master and owner of his own labour and land, if he had nothing but his hands. He may by industry quickly grow rich." Upstream from the original settlement is a recreated James Fort and harbour, where visitors can experience what life was like for the early settlers. The Living Museum was built in 1957 on the 350th anniversary of the first landing. Here people can learn and experience a number of activities, including tobacco growing, watching blacksmiths forge metal objects, practice how to fire a musket, and even try on armour. And in the small harbour are replicas of the three ships that the settlers arrived in. They were the Discovery, the Godspeed, and the Susan Constant, the largest ship of the group. The ships are seaworthy and sometimes sail to other historical events. On board, visitors can experience life at sea, climb into a sailor's bunk, steer the ship, and learn about handling the rigging. They can see for themselves the cramped conditions that the settlers, as well as crew, had to endure. It's all too easy in the modern world, when we can fly across the Atlantic in a few hours, to forget how, back in 1607, it took 4.5 months. "15 miles to the east, on the York River, is one of the most important historical sites in American history. Because it was here at Yorktown on October the 19th, 1778, that the English general, Lord Cornwallis, surrendered his forces to George Washington and effectively ended the American War of Independence. In August of 1781, Washington learned that the English army was encamped at Yorktown. He marched his army from New York and on the way joined up with French forces, who were his allies against the English. The bombardment and battle was fiercely fought and eventually hinged on the English hope of reinforcements, which did not arrive in time. And when Cornwallis tried to retreat across the York River and escape, he lost his boats in a storm. With little ammunition left, he was forced to surrender. Although the conflict dragged on for another year, it was this major English defeat that eventually saw the old American colony become the new United States. It was not until 1884 that the monument at Yorktown celebrating the victory was eventually built, having been authorized a century earlier. On the top is the figure of liberty. A few miles to the south is Langley, and one of the oldest continuously working Air Force bases in America, which was established in 1916. In 2010, Langley Air Force Base was amalgamated with the Army's Fort Eustis to become Joint Base Langley-Eustis. On the Air Force side, it's home to the 633rd Air Base Wing, and the base's mission is to sustain the ability for fast global deployment and air superiority for the United States or Allied armed forces. Amongst the many aircraft flown from here is the F-15 Eagle, as well as the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor, which was introduced in 2005. However, at a cost of around $150 million an aircraft, its future is in jeopardy. Close by Langley is the enormous moated Fort Monroe, built in the 1830s. At the time, it was referred to as the Gibraltar of Chesapeake Bay, for its strategic position on a peninsula guarding the James River, as well as the vast naval base at Norfolk, which is coming up next. Even though Virginia sided with the South's Confederate forces during the Civil War, Fort Monroe remained in the control of Union forces. Indeed, escaped slaves from the South were offered a safe haven if they could make it to the fort. It was rearmed during the First and Second World Wars, but with the development of long-range bombers, the fort became obsolete. But it was only in 2011 that Fort Monroe was finally decommissioned. Cruising out to sea on patrol past Fort Monroe is the United States ship Bulkley, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer commissioned in 2001. During its operations in 2011, the ship has participated in capturing 75 Somali pirates as part of a combined task force, and launched missiles against targets in Libya. The USS Bulkley's home port is Norfolk, where the US fleet for the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, as well as the Mediterranean Sea, is based. At the entrance to the Elizabeth River is Sewell's Point, and Naval Station Norfolk, which dates back to when the US entered the First World War in 1917. It has an 11-kilometre-long set of piers and wharves and can accommodate 75 warships, which makes it the largest concentration of Navy forces in America, as well as the largest naval base in the world. And before the age of oil, all the ships needed coal, and in vast quantities. Virginia was, and still is, rich in coal, and at Lambert's Point is one of the largest coal transloading facilities in the world, which has a history going back to the 1880s. Further up the Elizabeth River is the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, a facility for building, remodelling and repairing the Navy's ships. It is the oldest such facility in the US and actually goes back to the days of British rule, when it was founded in 1767 and named Gosport Shipyard. After the War of Independence, the US Congress passed an act which took control of the facility. But the Civil War brought disaster to the yard. When Virginia joined the Confederacy in 1861, the Union supporting commander ordered its destruction. But it was too late, and the Southern Army took it over. But when they in turn were booted out, they actually did destroy it. And it was while it was being reconstructed, back in the hands of the Union forces, that they named it Norfolk Naval Shipyard. By the time of World War II, 43,000 personnel were employed, and close to 7,000 ships were built. After the war, the shipyard shifted from construction to repair, and today it is one of the few places where there is a dry dock large enough to accommodate a nuclear aircraft carrier. Lying in a permanent berth in the harbour is the USS Wisconsin, an Iowa-class battleship. She was launched in 1941, weighed 45,000 tons, and had a formidable array of firepower. Her biggest guns were 16 inches, and there were 9 of them, which served her well in the Second World War and the Korean War. In 1958, she was mothballed into the US Reserve Fleet, but she was brought out of retirement, reactivated and modernized in order to take part in Operation Desert Storm during the First Gulf War. The Wisconsin was finally decommissioned in 1991 and brought here to Norfolk to the National Maritime Center and opened as a museum. However, the United States Congress has ordered that she must not be altered in any way that could prevent her becoming active again. She must be preserved in a good condition, and that the Navy should have a plan for a rapid reactivation in case she is needed in a national emergency. The city of Norfolk has had a checkered history and been destroyed several times, both by an enemy as well as by fire. In 1776, during the War of Independence, 3 British ships sailed into the harbour and bombarded Norfolk for about 8 hours. Over 800 buildings were lost, and most of the city caught fire. It was only just recovering by 1804 when another fire destroyed 300 buildings, causing a serious economic setback. During the Civil War, Norfolk was taken and held by the Union forces, and as at Fort Monroe, many slaves escaped Confederate lines and sought freedom in the city, where they were welcomed and schools set up so that many of them could learn to read and write for the first time. It was in 1907, during a naval review at Sewell's Point at the mouth of the river, that it became clear the potential of the harbour as a naval base. By 1917, the naval dockyard was expanding fast, and the city of Norfolk prospered as a result. It was a building at the Virginia Beach Boulevard in 1922, from Norfolk to the oceanfront, that put the city of Virginia Beach on the map. It was also the most easily accessible resort in the state. One historic building stands out, which was constructed in the Roaring Twenties and the age of the Charleston, the Cavalier Hotel. This was one of the first luxury hotels to be built in Virginia Beach, and in 1927, when it opened its doors, it attracted the rich and famous. Each room had a special tap for seawater, as this was considered medically beneficial at the time. And in every room there was also a tap for ice-cold water, which came from a large wooden tub on the roof, packed with chunks of ice. and it was not far to go to enjoy a few hours on the beach in the sun or sheltered behind an umbrella or two. Virginia Beach is as popular today as it was over 90 years ago. To the north is Cape Henry, overlooking the entrance to Chesapeake Bay, where two lighthouses have in turn been warning ships of danger for over 200 years. The shorter of the two is the earlier lighthouse, authorized by the fledgling US government in 1792. It was also the first federal construction under the new Constitution. George Washington, the first president, took an active interest in the project and indeed had a hand in picking the initial lighthouse keeper. This historic landmark was built with the same stone which was used in the White House in Washington. It is 8-sided and rises to around 30 meters. The light on the top used to be 2 fish oil burning lamps. By the 1870s, there were concerns about the structure's safety, and a new, taller lighthouse was built close by in 1881. 100 years later, it was fully automated and is still active today. Cape Henry was named after the eldest son of King James I of England in 1607, because it was here that the original settlers in the ships, Godspeed, Discovery and Susan Constant, had their landfall after crossing the Atlantic. And to mark this event, and also give thanks for a safe crossing, they erected a simple wooden cross before heading upriver, where they founded the Jamestown settlement. This stone cross was set up in 1935 by the daughters of the American colonists, and stands close to what is thought to be the original site. In the 1960s, it was decided to build a bridge across Chesapeake Bay, which would also incorporate 2 tunnels, so that large ships could get up to Baltimore and other ports. There are 19 kilometers of trestle bridge, 2 1.5-kilometer long tunnels, 4 artificial islands, 2 high-level bridges, and roughly 3 kilometers of causeway. Since it opened, the Bay Bridge Tunnel has been crossed by more than 100 million vehicles. The construction cost roughly $200 million and was funded entirely by selling bridge bonds, and no public money was spent. Construction had to cope with severe weather conditions, including hurricanes, and during the 2-year building program, 7 workers were killed. In the 1990s, the trestle bridge sections were increased to 4 lanes, but it was considered too expensive to widen the tunnels. By law, the bridge must be checked and serviced every 5 years, but as it takes 5 years to complete, the work never stops. The bridge joins the main part of Virginia to a separate peninsula, which is joined to Maryland in the north. And on the east side is a wild and beautiful landscape, especially the bays, inlets and grass-covered marshes. And running free in the Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge are the Assateague horses. Legend has it that they descend from the survivors of a wrecked Spanish galleon in the 16th century. The total herd figure is around 150, and to keep it to that number, the mares are given a contraceptive injection. These white egrets live happily alongside the horses as they feed off the insects that surround them. This peaceful scene is a good place to end this journey. Our journey begins on the coast at Saint-Nazaire and the mouth of the River Loire. And along the river valley are some of the finest castles, palaces and houses in France. As we head upriver past Nantes, the main towns on our journey will be Angers, Tours, Blois and Orléans. Some of the palaces we will see are enormous and ancient, built over 400 years ago. Many of the castles date back even further in time. At Orléans, we head northeast, away from the river, to end our journey at 2 palaces. First, Fontainebleau, and then on to one of the architectural masterpieces of Europe, Vaux-le-Vicomte. Saint-Nazaire, on the north bank of the Loire estuary, came into prominence during the 19th century, when the harbour expanded, shipbuilding began, and the railway arrived. The harbour is perhaps most famous for the daring and successful British commando raid during World War II, when an old ship full of explosives was rammed into the dock gates to prevent the use of the dry dock by large German battleships. The Germans used Saint-Nazaire as a base for naval operations in the Atlantic, and inside the harbour is an enormous old German U-boat pen with concrete an incredible 9 meters thick, which was capable of withstanding any Allied bomb. The robustness of its construction means that even today demolition would be uneconomical. The base is now used by cafes, a bar, and on the roof is an exhibition about the harbour. The Loire is the longest river in France at 1,012 kilometres. It's been referred to as the Garden of France and is flanked by hundreds of historic estates as well as many famous French wine regions that line the banks: Muscadet, Sancerre, Puy-Fumé. The city of Angers lies in the Loire Valley, 3 miles north of the river on a small tributary. The Château d'Angers has a history stretching back to the Romans, who had a fort on the site. The 17 massive towers were built in the 14th century and reduced in height during the 16th century with the stone used for developing the growing town. Further damage was done to the castle during the German occupation of World War II, when a munitions dump inside the chateau exploded. But even with all that's happened to the castle over the years, it's still an impressive sight. An equally impressive sight, and the first of many on this journey, is the Château du Plessis-Bourret. It was built in only 5 years, from 1468, and has been altered externally very little since then. It even has the original working drawbridge. The style of conical roofs is something which can be seen in many of the houses and palaces along the Loire Valley. The river provides water for the fertile valley where farmland and vineyards are interspersed. Large parts of the landscape are also forested, with many of these forests going back to medieval days, when they were used as hunting parks attached to the different chateaux along the valley. The Château du Saumur stands on the edge of a forest, overlooking the river and town of the same name. It was built in the 13th century and later became the home of the Dukes of Anjou. Over the centuries, it has been used as a military barracks and a state prison under Napoleon Bonaparte. Today, it is undergoing extensive restoration. Another castle is 10 miles to the south on a small tributary of the Loire, the Château de Montreuil-Bellay. The castle seen today dates from the 13th century, with a turreted curtain wall built in the 15th century. During the French Revolution, it was taken over by the new government and turned into a women's prison for suspected royalists. In 1822, it was bought by a rich local merchant who divided the castle into rental units. His daughter then took over the whole property, and her descendants continue to live in the castle today. Standing in the middle of farmland is the stronghold of the Château du Rivaux. The castle was once 4-sided, with turret towers on each corner. As the turrets projected out from the wall, they were able to protect the entrance with an enemy trying to get across the drawbridge. Since 1992, the castle has undergone a great deal of restoration. The design of the castle is in a classic 15th century French style, with the aim of showing off the power and wealth of the owner. By the 17th century, styles had changed, and the Château d'Oiron on the southern edge of the Loire Valley has been built as a house rather than a fortress, and the design has been influenced by classical ideas from ancient Rome. At the end of the 17th century, the house was lived in by Madame du Montespan. She'd been King Louis XIV's mistress and moved into the chateau after he'd tired of her. The chateau was then ransacked in the 1790s during the French Revolution and left largely abandoned until it was bought by the state in the 1930s and turned into a very successful modern art museum. On the north bank of the river Vienne, close to where it meets the Loire, is the Château de Chinon. This massive fortress was built in the 12th century by King Henry II of England, who was also ruler of this area of France, which at the time was the separate kingdom of Anjou. King Henry died in the castle, and he and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, as well as his son Richard the Lionheart, are all buried in a nearby abbey. The castle was partially restored in the 19th century. At the confluence of the Vienne and Loire rivers is the Château de Montsoreau, built in 1455 as a strategic fortress controlling river traffic along the Loire. Like so many other castles in this valley, it was in near ruins by the end of the 19th century, until it was bought by the local council and eventually restored and turned into a museum. On another tributary of the Loire is the Château d'Azay-le-Rideau. It was built by a rich financier who wished to establish his new nobility. It was designed in the first stirrings of the new French Renaissance style of the early 16th century and sits in a dammed section of the River Indre. The 19th century writer Honoré de Balzac described the Château d'Azay-le-Rideau as bathing in the Indre River like a princely creature. The Château de Villandry is also built in the French Renaissance style and incorporates a 14th century tower fortress. But what marks this chateau out from the others is the spectacular formal garden. Once owned by Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, the chateau fell into disrepair and was on the verge of being demolished before being bought by a Spanish doctor, Joaquim Cavallo, in 1906. He then poured an enormous amount of time, money and devotion into restoring the chateau and creating one of the most beautiful gardens in the world. And like many other chateaux of the Loire, it is now a World Heritage Site. The gardens are laid out in a classic formal style, with several kilometres of box hedging. There are all sorts of water features, ornamental flower gardens, and even a vegetable parterre. "10 miles up the Loire is the largest city in central France, Tours. The 12th century cathedral stands on the south bank of the river. It was the arrival of the railway in the 19th century that saw the city revive its fortunes as it began to expand into the surrounding countryside. And in that countryside are some of the hundreds of vineyards that lie along the banks of the Loire. In the Vouvray wine region is one of the oldest vineyards in the Loire Valley, here at the Château de Moncoteur. Way back in the 10th century, caves were excavated in the riverbank to mature and preserve the wine. By the 15th century, Vouvray's fame had spread across much of northern Europe, and the vineyards were cultivated in the best positions overlooking the river. The chateau itself dates back to the 15th century, though it was severely damaged by fire and nearly destroyed during the French Revolution. In fact, going back even further in time to the 4th century, the estate belonged to the Bishop of Tours. Vouvray is made from the Chenin Blanc grape, which can be enjoyed in dry wines, sweet ones, and also in a sparkling version. Due to the abundant acidity, Vouvray can age for quite some time, and also some varieties can be drunk when young. Upriver is the Royal Château d'Amboise, which King Charles VII seized from Louis d'Amboise in 1434, after condemning him to death for plotting against the crown. Charles then set about extensively rebuilding the chateau into a favourite of French kings during the 16th century. He also laid out the first formal Renaissance-style garden in France. Like so many other palaces along the Loire, it fell into disrepair over the centuries, and large parts were demolished. But it's still an imposing sight. As is the Pagoda de Chanteloup, the only surviving bit of the now demolished Château de Chanteloup. This Chinese-inspired tower is 44 metres tall and, rather like a wedding cake, has 7 tiers. Inside, a staircase allows visitors to climb to the top and look down into the semicircular reflecting pool. The pagoda was built by the Duc de Choiseul in 1775, when he was exiled to his estate for defying King Louis XV. He saw it as a temple of friendship for all the well-wishers who came to see him during his disgrace. This is the Château de Chenonceau, and surely one of the most sublime in the Loire Valley. With the palace built across the river Cher and the arches reflected in the still water, the sheer beauty of Chenonceau has made it the most visited of all the chateaux of the Loire. The main section was built in the 1520s, but was later seized by the crown for unpaid debts. It was then given to King Henry II's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who improved the house and built a bridge across the river. After the king's death, his wife and regent, Catherine de' Medici, had Diane de Poitiers expelled from Chenonceau by exchanging it for the Château de Chaumont, which we will see later. In the 1560s, Catherine de' Medici would spend a fortune on the house, and most importantly, build a gallery on top of the bridge that gives Chenonceau its shape today. She also replanted the garden in a formal style. The Queen held spectacular parties, often at night, and it's said she held the first ever firework display in France. After her death in 1589, the chateau went through a series of owners until one of them, in the early 18th century, sold off all the contents. Chenonceau was saved during the Revolution because the bridge was the only one for many miles. In 1913, the Menier family, famous for their chocolates, bought the house, restored it, and still own it today. And in a final thought, Chenonceau played a part during World War II, as the bridge separated Nazi-occupied France with the French Free Zone on the opposite bank, and was used by many people to escape. Continuing upstream along the Loire is the Château de Chaumont, which Diane de Poitiers moved to after being forced out of Chenonceau. It was built on a hill overlooking the river in the early 1500s in a medieval fortress style, but decorated with some early Renaissance details. In the 18th century, the north wing of the castle was demolished to provide a better view of the river. After much neglect, the state bought Chaumont in 1938, and it's now a museum. 10 miles up the Loire is the town of Blois and its enormous royal chateau, which was a residence of several French kings. The Château de Blois was built between the 13th and 17th centuries, comprising several buildings around the main courtyard. The palace has 564 rooms, each with its own fireplace, 75 staircases, and 100 bedrooms. One of the best-known parts of the palace is the monumental staircase built in 1515. It's covered with decorative sculpture and dominates the central courtyard. At the end of this long avenue is the Château de Cheverny, which was completed in 1650 for the Hureau family. The house has been built in a rigidly symmetrical design, with a roofline which seems to break the building into 5 separate sections. During the French Revolution, the family had to give up much of their wealth and therefore were forced to sell the house in 1802. But they bought it back in 1834. In 1914, the château was opened to the public, one of the first great French houses to do so. Children visiting may well feel they recognize the château, because the Belgian comic book creator, Hergé, used Cheverny as the inspiration for Marlinspike Hall in his Adventures of Tintin books. A few miles to the north is the Château de Ville-Savin, built in the 1530s for Jean le Breton. The château was constructed by the master craftsmen who had worked at the royal palaces on the Loire. This was because Jean de Breton was Secretary of Finance to King François I, and also Superintendent of Works for the hunting lodge that the king was building in a forest 4 miles away, the Château de Chambord. This is perhaps one of the best known and most recognizable chateaux in the world because of its monumental scale and distinctive French Renaissance style. It's a mixture of old medieval forms with new classical ideas from Italy. The enormous roofline is a mass of intricate designs of chimneys and cupolas that almost resemble a skyline of a fantasy town. The project was so costly that it was never finished, and only the central section and north side were completed. So who designed this enormous palace? One suggestion is that Leonardo da Vinci, who had been a guest of King François at another Loire chateau, was responsible. However, there is no real evidence to prove it, and in fact to this day it's still a matter of controversy as to who really was the architect of Chambord. The king spent barely 7 weeks a year at the chateau on short hunting visits, and any visit at the time meant that all the furniture and wall coverings had to be transported, unpacked, and then packed up after the hunting trip finished. Future kings largely abandoned Chambord, and Napoleon gave it to one of his generals, who then sold it. After many owners who tried to look after it, the state took over, and it's now a very popular museum. Today, the River Loire has around 150 bridges across it, many of them historic. This is the bridge at Beaugency, which has a history stretching back to the 14th century. During its long life, the bridge has been extended, repaired, and parts rebuilt. The different shaped arches give a clue to all this work. Over the centuries, floods and ice in winter have caused much damage. War also played its part, because in 1870 one span was destroyed on the orders of the French military during the Franco-Prussian War. In the 1970s, this historic bridge, which was becoming unstable, was completely restored and shored up. Today, the River Loire is navigable for large boats for only about 30 miles. But 200 years ago, the river was an important trading route, and flat-bottom barges could travel over 200 miles upstream to Orléans. The city is dominated by one of the largest cathedrals in France, Sainte-Croix d'Orléans, which was first built in the 13th century and then rebuilt in the 16th century after being damaged in war. At Orléans, the River Loire bends to the south, and our journey heads northeast to a royal palace. This is the Palace of Fontainebleau, and the work of many French monarchs. It was begun back in the 16th century and is arranged around a series of courtyards. It was Francois I, creator of Chambord, who built the initial courtyard. Succeeding French kings then added more. But by the middle of the 17th century, Fontainebleau began a steady decline, as the Palace of Versailles took over the interest of King Louis XIV. During the French Revolution of the late 18th century, the entire contents of Fontainebleau were sold off to ensure it could not be used as a royal palace again. However, within a decade, Napoleon Bonaparte began to transform the palace into a symbol of his grandeur. And it was here, in 1814, that he bade an emotional farewell to his old guard, before going into exile on the Isle of Elba. A few miles to the north is the final destination of this journey, and one of the greatest architectural masterpieces of not only France, but of the world, the Château de Vaux-le-Vicomte. In 1641, a young parliamentarian called Nicolas Fouquet bought an old castle and estate at Vaux-le-Vicomte. 15 years later, he had risen to the powerful position of finance minister to King Louis XIV. And in this position, he was able to amass a small fortune, which meant he could begin construction of what was to become the finest chateau and garden in France. This spectacular achievement we see today was the result of Fouquet picking the best people to carry out his dream. The first was the architect Louis Levaux, the second was the painter and decorator Charles Lebrun, and the third was the garden designer André Lenotre. Working closely with their patron, they were to create not only a spectacular house, but also a centre and haven for leading French artists of the day, all of whom contributed to the beauty of Vaux. For the plan of the garden to work, Fouquet purchased and then demolished 3 villages. The displaced villagers were then employed in the upkeep and maintenance of the gardens. It was said that he employed 18,000 workers to create the gardens at a staggering cost in today's money of around $150 million. All this wealth and influence meant Fouquet had enemies, and they conspired to ruin him. In August of 1661, Fouquet held a spectacular garden party for the king to show off his new house and garden. It was to be his downfall, because it was not a good idea to outshine the king, who had Fouquet arrested for embezzlement and imprisoned for life. Louis then confiscated most of the furniture, tapestries and pictures, as well as all the garden statues and orange trees. He also took the 3 designers, Levaux, Lebrun and Lenotre, and put them to work on his new palace, Versailles. By 1875, Vaux-le-Vicomte was in a terrible state, but luckily for us today, it was bought by a French industrialist, Alfred Sommier, who, together with his descendants, slowly brought the great chateau back to life, so that visitors can marvel at this quite fantastic palace and garden. A perfect place to end this journey.